In one of my earlier videos, I talked about how I went through a Sartrean phase that began as an undergraduate and then ran into graduate school. And I went through a number of different phases. I'm going to shoot some various videos on those, talking about why I was attracted to those modes of thought, what I get out of them, and eventually, for most of them, why I left them behind, even though I still have an appreciation for them. And another philosopher who's been very important for me as a person, although I disagree with him on many different things, is Friedrich Nietzsche. And I would say that I was a full-blown Nietzschean at one point. It's a little bit hard to say that anyone's truly a Nietzschean, because Nietzsche himself is, sort of all over the map with his set of ideas. Not all of them really harmonize that well with each other, and I think there's a good case to be made that was in some respects deliberate on his part. He thinks that reality is fundamentally contradictory and active, the product of the will to power playing itself out in many different dimensions, in many different ways historically, and that it's difficult to attain anything like a purely objective, completely agreed upon, rationally justified perspective in all respects. So it's kind of to be expected that different people would make different things out of Nietzsche. So I'm not going to talk about Nietzsche as Nietzsche, if there is such a thing, and I'm not going to talk about Heidegger's Nietzsche or Deleuze's Nietzsche or so-and-so's Nietzsche, except insofar as they were interesting to me and played a role for me. So I first got introduced to Nietzsche back when I was just getting out of high school, and it wasn't through any of my high school studies. I actually did have a philosophy class in high school, which was not a particularly good philosophy class. It was, quite frankly, very boring and turned me off on what they were calling philosophy. But then I had a really great philosophy class. I'll do a video about that with this guy, Mr. Lorenzo, that I learned a lot from without realizing it. And then I started frequenting used bookstores quite a bit, in part because I had friends who would do that sort of thing, and in part because I loved getting my hands on books and just pouring through them. And I'm not sure exactly what it was that I got my hands on. It was some selections book of Nietzsche, and what I found in there was really heady. And I think what I was trying to do was make sense out of a lot of things at the time. I was, in some respects, as a lot of adolescents and teenagers are, profoundly unhappy and not really quite sure about how to get out of it. I had all sorts of romantic notions about what I ought to be doing, or the perfect job for me, and there's a whole mess of things that I could talk about with that. But I was always searching for something. I was always searching for what we would call something with metaphysical depth, and I found that in Nietzsche, and not just metaphysical depth, but a metaphysics of personality, a metaphysics of human persons that doesn't see us as just sort of epiphenomena of natural events, but sees us and the choices that we make and the commitments that we sort our way through, and our own histories and our relationships as being in some ways foundational. And I found that in Nietzsche, and I found certain types of analyses in Nietzsche that seemed to make good sense to me at the time and for quite a while. As a matter of fact, there's some things where I think Nietzsche really got things quite right, even today. So I got introduced to Nietzsche in a very unsystematic way, and I actually remember this kind of funny thing that happened. I got invited to this friend's party, and I was actually just working as a grill cook and studying karate and working out about 3-4 hours a day, and hanging around with my burnout friends, and sometimes going to parties and just living this kind of heavy metal ruffian kind of lifestyle, right? But I was reading a lot too at the same time, and Some of my friends were real readers, some of them weren't. So I got invited to this party, and it was for a guy who I had sort of lost touch with. It was his birthday party. I'd lost touch with him a while back, and so I went to his party, and there were a few people that I knew because we went to different high schools. We were in the same middle school together, and then we kind of went different ways. And there was a guy there. There were a lot of college types there, like, you know, they were in their freshman year of college, because that's what should have been my freshman year of college, but instead I was you know, studying karate and working as a grill cook and getting into, you know, various sorts of fairly light trouble and all that sort of stuff, and reading lots and lots of stuff that I could get my hands on very omnivorously. And so I'd read some Nietzsche, and I was really kind of interested in this stuff. And the guy was a philosophy major, and he said, you know, that came up in conversation. He was driving me home from the party because I couldn't get a ride otherwise, and I'd have to walk, like, you know, 6 miles or so. So we started talking, and then I mentioned that I was reading Nietzsche, and he got a very snooty attitude with me. You know, how could you possibly be understanding anything about Nietzsche if you don't have a teacher? You can't just read this stuff on your own. But that's what I was doing, you know. And just to give you sort of an idea of what was going on, I was like reading Nietzsche at the same time as I was reading Eugene O'Neill's plays, and I was reading, you know, the history of the Mongol Empire, and, you know, just sort of reading whatever I felt like, you know, thinking about at the time, whatever was fascinating me. So, you know, some of Nietzsche's ideas kind of stuck with me. This notion of the will to power, this notion of unmasking that a lot of times, you know, what seems to be going on the surface really isn't what's going on. You got to dig deeper, and that our affects, our emotions, are intimately connected with our pretense to rationality. That even when we're completely rational, our emotions are integrated with that as well. That was something that I thought was very very fruitful. Nietzsche's perspectivism was also something that I was really interested in the time. The fact that you could take any standpoint and find another standpoint to contrapose to it, and then start saying, well, which of these is actually the correct one, and how would you decide between them? That was important for me. And I didn't do a very good job in conveying it to this guy that I was talking about, but I was thinking about these things. And then, you know, I go into the Army, and I really didn't think about Nietzsche much then. It's too bad, because, you know, I was stationed in Germany, so I could have gotten my hands on a lot of Nietzsche texts if I'd been smart. But, you know, my philosophical career is, for the most part, this guy just sort of, it's almost like a picaresque novel. This guy just wanders around into this and that and this and that. So, in any case, I then encountered Nietzsche again when I was in undergraduate, and kept reading him, and you know, Kierkegaard, Sartre, Nietzsche, Camus, those were the guys that I really enjoyed reading, and, you know, I looked for the sort of common themes between these guys, and the notion of commitment, and that you actually had to try things and experiment, and that, you know, don't immediately assume that, you know, what people are saying is really on the surface is true. That was part of what attracted me to Nietzsche. Another thing that really attracted me to Nietzsche was his sort of unrelenting elitism, and I'll be quite honest with you, I've kind of gotten away from this in part not by abandoning a sense that, look, there's a higher and you ought to aim for that higher as best as you can, and there's a bunch of gradations. I've gotten away from, you know, just sort of saying if you don't have the top, everything else is crap, by seeing, you know, the progress that has to be made, and by learning how to be empathetic and to appreciate, you know, things at other levels and appreciate where people are. But one of the things that really did attract me to Nietzsche was his unrelenting elitism, and his insistence that democracy was nonsense, that this, let's put it to the public to decide, what, you know, he said this along with Kierkegaard, it was just silly, that when it came to fundamental, important life questions, you had to figure these things out for yourself, and you shouldn't leave them to other people's stock answers or what they're comfortable with, or even the people who act like they're progressive. I remember people saying things, you know, it was very popular back when I was in college to say, who gave you the right to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was usually done to try to, you know, shame somebody in the service of being progressive. And then I would say, well, who gave you the right to ask who you know, what right anybody has? I mean, you're just asserting yourself, basically. You're acting like an aggressor just like this guy over here that you're criticizing. So why don't you act like a real aggressor, take the mask off, and actually, you know, measure up to your own desire there. Why don't you just come right out and say that you want things this way, and don't be passive aggressive about it. Later on, I learned to see that was what, you know, Nietzsche's calling ressentiment. But so I was struggling with all these sorts of things. With Nietzsche, there was this sense that there was a climb, that philosophy was this constant ascesis, this effort to try to rid yourself of preconceptions and the detritus of the past and what was not really living but sort of parasitical on your life, and to experience and to come to make your own judgments. And there's a paradox involved with that, of course, because if you're doing that because Nietzsche told you to, are you really doing what Nietzsche is telling you to? Not exactly. And there's also this sense in Nietzsche that, look, there are some people that are just, you know, spontaneously more energetic, more willing to, you know, push things, more willing to try things, more willing to get in the fray. And with those sort of people, don't try to put all sorts of restrictions on them. Let them do what they're going to do. Those are the strong. Those are the class that, you know, will be the master. You know, perhaps even the Übermensch, the Superman, the Overman. Well, you know, when you read Nietzsche, of course, and you're just getting out of your teen years into your 20s, and you're in, as I was at that time, just amazing shape. You know, if you're working out 3-4 hours a day, with various types of training, and you already are kind of tough anyway by the way that you grew up and the circumstances that you went through. Well, you're gonna have this natural tendency to, if not seeing yourself in the role of that person, you want to shoot for that, and that's part of what was going on. I also love the fact that Nietzsche was such a witty and brilliant and incisive analyst of other people's philosophy, of literary developments, of political developments. You know, the guy had something to say about all these different things. And I wasn't so concerned, I think, at that time with whether they were really true or right, or to what degree they were. I was more, you know, it was sort of like putting on a suit, or putting on some sort of costume. It let you do something. There was kind of a dramatic role of being a Nietzschean. Now, I started getting more and more rigorous in my study of Nietzsche. You know, I kind of forced myself to try to read as much as I could. I have to admit that, you know, when I was an undergraduate, I didn't find Thus Spoke Zarathustra particularly interesting. I was much more interested in works like the Genealogy of Morals and The Will to Power and the Birth of Tragedy, things that had a bit more, they were a little bit less narrative and a little bit more either aphoristic or systematic, you know, where a picture was being drawn. I felt like I don't need a narrative. I can come up with my own narrative and figure that out. I want ideas. I want explanations. I want you to tell me how things actually work so I can start getting my hands dirty with it. I didn't realize how important Nietzsche was to continental thought until, and there's a whole story that I'll tell about this some other time, about 3/4 of the way through my undergraduate, I started actually reading some contemporary continental philosophy, and I saw how Nietzschean themes were playing out in people like Foucault and Deleuze and Derrida and Barthes, and, you know. I saw how I saw the uses they made of him and the homage that they gave to him, Bataille, people like that. And so by the time that I got out of undergraduate, and I had that year where I just worked, and it was mostly crap jobs that I worked, and studied intensively and worked out all the more, and worked on my languages, and then prepared for going to Europe and then going to graduate school. I was getting more and more into Nietzsche, and so by the time that I actually got to graduate school, I was still reading Sartre quite a bit, but I had shifted much more to seeing things in a Nietzschean way. I found that Nietzsche was a richer thinker than Sartre. And one of the things that I really loved about Nietzsche was his attentiveness to language. When I first got to graduate school, my intention was to specialize in philosophy of language, in part because I was learning languages, and I was seeing connections between things, and I was really interested in the how language fits in and conditions the way in which we view things, and the way in which we act, and the things that we imagine possible for ourselves, and how it conditions culture, where words come from. I was interested in all these sorts of topics. I didn't realize that analytic philosophy of language, as opposed to the continental philosophy of language, was not going to be actually dealing with those sorts of things too much, at least not in the ways that I was particularly interested in. But I'll talk about that in another video. So anyway, with Nietzsche, being able to apply the things that he was saying to interactions with other people, and to analyze the conversations and the arguments, and being able to make sense out of what was going on in graduate school, because at least the graduate school that I went to was very aggressive between us graduate students and even some of the professors, the engagements that we had, and yet there was always this sort of veneer of yes, we're just doing something academic, we're being very civil and nice to each other, but the undercurrent was quite often all this emotional stuff that was kind of interesting to think about and pay attention to. And again, my attitude was, hey, just tear the masks off. And I was getting that from Nietzsche. Now, what was really interesting for me, my first, say, year in graduate school, was I got an office, and I would hang out in my office late at night and work on stuff and read and all that. There was another graduate student who I got to be good friends with, who was 2 years ahead of me, and he was also very interested in Nietzsche. And we had, when we started comparing things, he was also much better schooled than I was. He'd gone to Penn State, and had professors who actually groomed you and took an interest in your development and tried to make sure that you actually knew what was going on in contemporary philosophy. So he was really into Stanley Rosen's understanding of Nietzsche, and Rosen had certain themes that he would go after time and time again. Much more interested in the connection between politics and philosophy than I was. And I was, if anybody I would say was the biggest influence on me at the time, it was probably Kaufman, his views on Nietzsche. But really, my view was always, well, let's just read Nietzsche and not read so-and-so on Nietzsche and then compare it to so-and-so on Nietzsche. Let's actually read the guy himself and see what he has to say. So we would get into these big arguments back and forth in the middle of the night, sometimes late, sometimes actually into the early morning, in this this giant concrete complex that was our office building. There's again a whole story to be told about that place as well. It was built by a prison architect and had some quite interesting design features. So there were a couple things that were really good about that. One was, it was good to see other people's perspectives on Nietzsche. The other thing was, when you have an interlocutor who knows their stuff and disagrees with you, you really got to go back to the text and make sure you know what you're talking about. And so that's what I had to do. And it turned out there were sometimes things I'd misread and didn't get right. And with Nietzsche, that's not too difficult to do, since he's a tricky writer and sometimes says things over here that seem to contradict what he's saying over here, and if you're not paying close attention, you might miss it. Again, through this entire period, I would say that the concepts I was most interested in were, the ways in which the will to power that everyone has within them, an aggressive will to dominate, plays itself out, either aggressively or passive-aggressively. And then about, I think I'd already finished my master's and I was beginning my PhD coursework. They convinced Stephen Timon to teach a class on Nietzsche. Usually he would teach, the German idealism stuff, and Hegel, and Heidegger as well. But there was this clamor, hey, this guy is really good with the German stuff, let's have him teach Nietzsche. So he taught a class on Nietzsche, and he started out with Deleuze's Nietzsche book, and the way it worked was each one of us had to read this text and then present it to the class. So since my French was particularly good, and I already knew some of the Nietzsche stuff, and I'd already read Deleuze in other contexts, and I kind of liked Deleuze, I sort of just digested the whole book, within about a week, and then presented it to the class with commentary too on how the translation over here was a little bit different than what you might expect from the French. And with Deleuze, it was really quite interesting because you could see that for him, Nietzsche was this great liberating force that sort of tore away French philosophy, and he was very concerned with making sure that we never fell back into dialectics. And with Deleuze, the key conception was force, which is closely connected to will to power, and active and reactive forces, and that's how he interpreted Nietzsche, at least in that book, little book, Nietzsche. And I read other people's views on him as well, and then that was the semester of intensive concentration on the whole corpus of the works, but in particular on the genealogy of morals, which I went over to the library and got the German copy and started digging my way through it, and it was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. It was a very heady time. I love Nietzsche not only as a thinker but also as a stylist. His German is quite beautiful in many respects, except when he tries to write poetry. But in, when he's writing prose, he is just brilliant. And he does what a lot of other Germans do and makes up words by compounds, but they actually make sense and fit in his works. And he's intentionally ambiguous, and he exploits the resources of every language that he works with masterfully. And so it was a real treat to do that. Now, what started going on after that was, I would say what ended up shifting me out of Nietzsche was becoming dissatisfied with where he was going. It did seem to me ultimately to place you in the problematic of, are you going to just do this sort of hyper-aggressive route, or are you going to work with this sort of defanged Nietzsche that a lot of people wanted to put forth so that they could have Nietzsche light and say that somehow Nietzsche was a feminist, or Nietzsche was a progressive, or Nietzsche was not really serious about this part, and or were you going to take him seriously and sort of see the whole world as essentially a massive field of aggression or passive aggression playing itself out, congealing itself into history. I never liked that trying to defang him, but on the other hand, I started to think, well, I'd read him and I'd think, well, you're actually wrong about this thing, and it's not so much that he was wrong; it's that when Nietzsche had decided about something, like, say, for example, Christianity just pretty much as a whole for Nietzsche is all just, bunk and, Platonism for the masses and all that. He does have a few things where, he says a few nice things about Jesus, and he also actually has a few nice things to say about the church, mainly when the church works as a power structure. But I was finding my way back to, or maybe, for the first time, into my Catholic faith, and reading a lot of Catholic authors, and I'd read them and I'd be like, man, if Nietzsche were actually right, Thomas Aquinas couldn't say anything intelligent like he is over here, or Anselm would have to be just shot full of ressentiment, but that doesn't appear to be the case. So Nietzsche must be missing out on something. And there were a lot more of those moments, and gradually they began to unravel this attachment that I had to seeing things through Nietzsche. And then, the language stuff, I started to shift more into the study of semiotics and into some of the more, recent continental philosophy discussions of that. So Nietzsche kind of got a little bit left behind on those things as well. Because in a lot of respects, when it comes to how he plays with language, he is sort of an old-fashioned romantic, thinking about the derivation of words and what that means for us and what it tells us. Something else that was particularly important for me was reading Max Schaller. And Max Schaller was a phenomenologist who for a long time was a Catholic, actually ends up leaving the church towards the end of his life. And Schaller was very impressed by Nietzsche, and he incorporated a lot of Nietzsche's insights into his work. And you might say, well, how can you do that? How can you do that as a Christian? Well, you integrate what's true in somebody, and you try to, not just like dust, push under the dustbin or something like that, the stuff that doesn't work. But you got to actually explain, well, why didn't he see this? Why didn't this work? And Schaller did that with Nietzsche, and he had some decent explanations for why Nietzsche went right and why and where Nietzsche went wrong. The concept of ressentiment is particularly good, and Schaller has an entire work devoted to this concept of ressentiment. He begins with Nietzsche, and then he questions, well, is Nietzsche actually getting it right about this? And what are the consequences if he doesn't? And so, it just sort of went on from there. I went from being what you might call a true believer and, a person who was trying to emulate Nietzsche and make him my own, and trying to think out certain problematics that came up with that, like, am I stuck in ressentiment, and how active should I be, and how should I be active, and if I'm listening to Nietzsche, am I really, as free as I ought to be? Maybe I should, like, throw the books away, and so I went from that to having a much more measured, less committed appreciation for Nietzsche, and I would say that means that I left my Nietzschean phase behind me. I would say as well, and this is what I'll close on, that I used Nietzsche an awful lot as a excuse or as a justifier for a lot of bad behavior on my own part, a lot of selfish behavior, a lot of self-indulgent behavior, a lot of putting people down, a lot of deliberately seeking out conflicts and being tendentious with people. And I would say things, and you don't have to necessarily have Nietzsche to do this. People do this all the time with, marketplace of ideas, and, it's good to always, confront people, which is nonsense. Really stupid nonsense. But, I would say stuff like that with the idea that, well, look, if you can't stand up to me, you're weak, and you don't deserve to be heard, so shut up. I'm going to lay this out. And at that time, I was very good at and I was very aggressive at demolishing people in arguments. So Nietzsche was kind of a natural fit for me. But I found that, once I started to attain some reflection on that, I really didn't like that part of myself. I didn't like the tendencies that were being encouraged with it. I didn't like what it seemed to be precluding, and the sort of damage that it was doing to relationships. The Nietzschean thinker has to do a really, tough tightrope walk in order to maintain good, healthy relationships, I think. So for me, the Nietzschean phase was something that I passed through. I still very much love to read Nietzsche. I like to teach him. I like to talk about him. I like to use some of his concepts. I think he's right about certain things. I think that he got some other things fundamentally wrong, and I actually feel that he might have restricted himself in certain ways. He might have been reactive in certain ways. But in any case, that's my Nietzschean phase, and I'll tell some more stories about different phases that I went through in my philosophical studies and career in some other videos.